views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
And hello, everyone. Welcome to the Social Justice Forums. I am Daren Jaime, and of course, we thank you for joining us. If you ask what the Social Justice Forums are about, well, it's a conversation, dialogue, interviews, talking about many of the inequities that people face. We discuss civic engagement and how you can be engaged. We also present multiple points of view. We talk about everything from civil rights, social justice, economic injustice, affordable housing, all of these things and more that you can find right here on the show. We got a very special show for you, so stay with us. The Social Justice Forums starts right now. And welcome back. Racism in the United States was at its worst during the 20th century, worse than any other period in American history. African Americans lost many civil rights gained during the Reconstruction era. Anti-Black violence, lynchings, segregation, legal and racial discrimination, and expressions of white supremacy have increased. Our first guest is an author of the book, The 20th Century Civil Rights Movement and Africana Studies Perspectives. The book is based on engagement with sources and writers who experienced working and interacting with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and other key actors in the civil rights movement. Joining us now to provide their point of view on this matter, I'm joined by the professor of the Department of Africana Studies at Lehman College, Dr. Mark Christian. And Dr. Mark, good to have you back.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Daren. It's nice to be here.
It's nice to have you here with us as well. Your work comes at a pivotal point in our history as we are now getting ready to see the nation begin to switch in the area of presidency. But one thing that still remains the same is racism, bigotry, and what we see right now, which is white nationalism and white supremacy. Talk to us a little bit about your book and what was the reason why you decided to write the book?
Well, you know, I've been teaching in higher education now for almost 30 years. I did my master's degree at Ohio State and in 92, 93. So I've been teaching around the area of Black studies for quite a long time now. The book has been in process for, I would say, about 2 years. I got a contract with Kendall Hunt to write the book, and they pushed me. And with this quarantine and the virus, I was able to have less distraction and able to focus on the book itself. So it's come out of my teaching. I dedicated it to the students I've taught over the past 28 years in higher education. And it's just a combination of those factors and the fact that I was able to spend some time writing rather than catching a virus.
Yeah. Talk to me about the 20th century. As you look at it, we talked about it here. Civil rights, of course, a major issue. That which people fought for seems to have been taken away. And we look now at a presidency. And now we could say the presidency of Donald Trump has come to an end. But during those years, some of the most treacherous years for America.
Yeah. When I look at the 20th century, I started with post-World War II, because that generation that fought during World War II came home to the United States with a little bit more optimism about what could happen to their lives and their communities, because they fought in a segregated army. The armed forces were not desegregated until 1948, which was 3 years after World War II. So in a sense, there was an impetus there with the desegregation of the armed services after World War II. And that generation, the likes of Medgar Evers came out of World War II and straight into Mississippi and the NAACP. And his activism was his cool calmness under pressure came from his experience of having served in World War II. So I emphasize the generation of World War II were fighting racism abroad, and they came home to fight racism at home. So the generation is very important from World War II of African Americans. Not sure you know this, but over 1 million African Americans, men and women, fought during World War II. And they were in tank battalions. There was a tank battalion called the 761st. And they weren't recognized. They weren't recognized in popular culture. They weren't recognized in documentaries until way, way past. So I emphasize that generation and everything they put into it. The discrimination they faced was profound because they came home still to a segregated society. And the Brown versus Board of Education from 1954, which brought down segregation in schools, was another impetus. The murders of George W. Lee, Reverend George Lee, was shot in the face trying to get people registered in Mississippi. Young Emmett Till was lynched at age of 14, going again to Mississippi. All of that produced a movement, if you like, that ushered in Martin Luther King in 1955 and the Rosa Parks incident. What I say in this book as well, it's very important to note here, Daren, is that Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King are not the only participants. There were literally hundreds, thousands of people involved in the civil rights movement in breaking down segregation and discrimination throughout society. Important to note, and it's in the book, other individuals before Rosa Parks, Sarah Keyes fought against discrimination in travel.
Right, because when we look at Rosa Parks, we know that she was the one who was credited for sitting, in the front of the bus. But the reality is she wasn't the first. And when you talk about Dr. Martin Luther King, with no disrespect, because he is definitely one of my heroes, we look at what happened with King and the civil rights movement. But I remember it being said, Rosa Parks, the person who first was on the bus, wasn't probably the best to be the face of the movement. The same way Dr. King, in many ways, was considered the best face for the movement, even though there were other people who had the movement going before him.
Correct. And what we need to know for our audience is that this has been a longevity of struggle. The civil rights movement of the 1950s didn't drop out of the sky. Like you said earlier, 19th century Reconstruction, all of that builds up to the 1950s. When Dr. King went to Washington in 1963, I've jumped ahead a little, but when he went for the March on Washington for jobs and freedom, he actually, the first part of that speech is about the indictment of America not fulfilling its promise of the 1963 Emancipation Proclamation. So he said, we've come to redeem a bounced check, if you like. And then he goes into the I have a dream aspect, which was extemporaneous. He just spoke from his mind. And they've forgotten the actual critique he gave earlier in the speech about coming to the Lincoln Memorial for justice, for social justice, because it's been a bounced check. 100 years later, after the Emancipation Proclamation, we're still not free. So, you want to?
Yeah.
So where am I? So 1963, the Brown versus Board of Education, World War II generation. All of these things are an impetus to the civil rights movement and the struggle that African Americans put their lives to. I was speaking to your colleague earlier about the 1965 struggle in Selma for voting rights. And we always see John Lewis, rightly so, as an icon of that particular experience. But he's not the only one again. I was thinking of George Floyd of last year being murdered. And a woman back in 1965, Amelia Boynton was her name then. She's now known as Amelia Boynton Robinson. She had a knee on her neck from a police officer as well, holding her down, and was beaten up. And she was in her mid-50s. And thankfully, she lived to over 100 years. But she's lost in history. And we've got to be always aware of the actors who get lost in history, because it was a movement, and charismatic leadership often overtakes the many hundreds of soldiers who were also putting their lives on the line for freedom. So John Lewis, great, wonderful human being, one of my heroes too, but there were also many other individuals, and I try to encapsulate that all within the book that I've produced.
Yeah, and in addition to talking about Dr. Martin Luther King, in addition to talking about Rosa Parks and those who were the civil rights, you also take time in really speaking to Malcolm X and the fact, because, you know, as a people, I think that America has always had to make a choice, Martin or Malcolm, either or. Are you on the side of Malcolm or are you on the side of Martin? And, you know, when you talk to those who have, you know, lived in that generation, they said they were almost forced to make a choice sometimes, but there were some who said it's not either or, it's both and.
I agree entirely. In fact, I would say myself, I'm old enough to be a son of Malcolm and Martin. In fact, I would situate myself right in the center, Malcolm on my left, Martin on my right, or vice versa. I feel that those two thinkers and those two activists and those two men who did so much for the emancipation, if you like, of our minds and our bodies are yin and yang, yin and yang. They're not opposites. They're not either or. They are yin and yang and should be melded, because both of them were coming together when they were assassinated. And it's important to know that Malcolm X is central to the civil rights era. He wasn't part of any civil rights movement organization. He was part of the Nation of Islam. So he gave a different voice. He was against nonviolence because he thought nonviolence was a weak strategy, because the nature of all creatures on earth, humans and creatures, is to defend yourself when you're attacked. That's the nature, human nature. If I attacked you, Daren, you would naturally defend yourself. So the strategy of nonviolence was quite courageous. But for Malcolm X, it was not very intelligent, because if somebody hits you, you should have the right to defend yourself. But Malcolm did not advocate violence for violence sake either. Malcolm was very, very against violence for violence sake, but he said quite clearly, quite strongly, that if somebody attacks you, you should have the right to defend yourself. And Black people, African Americans, were being attacked brutally by the police, by the KKK, by anybody who was against civil rights and their right to vote, their right to a decent education. They were fighting for was citizenship and to be treated equally. And this is what we have to understand. Yes, the media and many commentators have put us against our leaders. Oh, you should stay with Martin because Martin's about nonviolence. Keep away from Malcolm because Malcolm is a violent person. No, they were neither of them were against each other. They just had different strategies for gaining freedom for African Americans. And again, it's all in the book. Under a chapter on Malcolm X, his development as a person, because he had a very difficult childhood, you know. His father was murdered by the KKK. His mother didn't receive her insurance policy that she was due because of institutionalized racism. The family disintegrates, and Malcolm is put in foster families. And the N-word is used so much for Malcolm as a kid in these white homes that he was put into, that he thought it was a pet name. So he as he developed, you've got to understand Malcolm's development as a child is far different than Dr. King's. Dr. King had a very comfortable childhood, a very loving home, 3 meals a day, good education. Malcolm is the opposite. His teacher puts him off education. He said, he says, "What do you want to be, Malcolm, when you grow up?" And Malcolm says, "Well, sir, I'm thinking of being a lawyer." He was top of the class in his school. And the lawyer looks at him, "Malcolm, that's not realistic for an N. You should think about doing something you can do, like carpentry." And that's what turned Malcolm off education. And he went into petty criminality and then got into prison. And prison actually became a savior for young Malcolm. He was 21 years of age in prison. And then he began to read. And his brothers, I'm not sure how many people know this, but his family were in the Nation of Islam before Malcolm. They introduced Malcolm into the Nation of Islam. His brother Reginald was very prominent in that sense. So you've got to look at Martin and Malcolm as they developed, and then you understand them much, much better. And then you can appreciate both of them, because we're in a world now where we need both Martin and Malcolm. And we always have. We always needed different perspectives that speak to the empowerment of Black people.
Absolutely. And when you talk about Martin and Malcolm, obviously there are two heroes that are considered for the civil rights movement during the time of the 60s, two people that are widely revered and still spoken about to this very present day. But I also want to talk about women, because there were very many women that were involved, not just in civil rights, but in the whole social justice movement. Talk to us, because in your book, and those that don't know, Dr. Mark Christian has his book, 20th Century Civil Rights, and talking about that, talking about the civil rights movement, talking about social justice, letting people know a little bit more about the history from whence African Americans, and not just Americans, but African Americans, but America has come. Talk to us a little bit about women, because women have played an integral part in this movement, and I know that you take the time to highlight 8 of them in your book.
Absolutely, and I could have highlighted 800.
Right.
The issue that we lose. I've dedicated a chapter actually to African American women leaders. So there's a whole chapter. There's 8 profiled, but then there's a discussion around women in general. And again, we can go right back into history and find many women who were amazing social justice advocates. One of my favorites is Ida B. Wells Barnett, who in the 19th century, she touched base with Frederick Douglass. She was a young lady who was a journalist, and she was based in Memphis, and she was writing about anti-lynching. Her printing press was destroyed, and she was chased out of town. She went to Liverpool, England, where I was born and raised, and fighting and protesting against anti-lynching. I'm saying this for longevity purposes. And you can go right through the decades and you will find many great women. Mary Church Terrell was another. Many women contributed to African-American freedom. In fact, they've been the bedrock of organizations. Now, to fast forward to the civil rights movement, there are a number of women who are very important. You can think of Ella Baker, Diane Nash, prominent organizers. Fannie Lou Hamer was a prominent organizer, but I left them out because I didn't profile them, because they are fairly well known now, thankfully. But the likes of, have you ever heard of Joanne Robinson?
Yes, I have.
Joanne Gibson Robinson. Well, Joanne, she was essential to the Montgomery bus boycott. She's the one who printed up all the leaflets and got the Women's Political Council involved in the strike. She ran around. She was a teacher in Montgomery, Alabama. And so I profiled Joanne Robinson because Joanne Gibson Robinson. She never used Robinson back in the day. She used Gibson. They've all passed. She passed away in 1992, but they've left memoirs. And that's another thing I want to get into here. I've used the memoirs of those activists largely in the book. I've gone to their stories because they're the closest we have in my generation and the generations that will follow me. Those stories for me are the most authentic. You know, when we think of the women, we don't think of their memoirs. You know, there's Angela Davis. She wrote an autobiography. She's integral to the 1960s. Also, Mamie Phipps. Do you know her, Mamie Phipps? Well, Mamie Phipps Clark. She was the first to get a psychology degree from Columbia University in 1943, and her advisor was a staunch racist. So she married Kenneth Clark. I know you know Kenneth Clark from Harlem, but those two, as a man and wife, they created the doll experiment that pushed forward the 1954 Board versus Education case. You know, you've heard of the doll test, where young black children were chosen to pick a white doll or a black doll, which is the best doll. And the majority of black children picked the white doll as the best doll, and the black doll was a bad doll. And so they showed clearly in their experimentation that the psychology of racism is deeply embedded in all of our minds as black individuals. And so that was a very powerful thing. Mamie Phipps Clark is largely hidden in history as well. So I profiled here also. Amelia Boynton, she is also goes by Robinson later on. No connection to the other Robinson, Joanne Robinson. But Amelia was at the 1965 Voting Rights Act march in Selma, and she got beaten up, and she got a knee on her neck from police officers. You know, she was beaten up like George Floyd from May 25th, 2020, which will go down in history in our generation. So the past also leans into the present. So I can't emphasize the importance of women.
Yeah.
And, I've put many in there that will, and the chapter and the references will give the reader much more scope to study further and deeper than what I could go.
There's about 370 pages in your book, and it's a good long read. Talk to us about the pandemic, because you said the pandemic gave you some time to get this book, out and published. But talk to me about how hard was it for you to actually be able to concentrate, focus, and given the fact that when you're writing this book, we're in the middle of political unrest, we're in the middle of social unrest, and we're in the middle of re-heightened, racial tension.
For me personally, the quarantine was very good because I had less distraction. You can see the library behind me, my personal home library. I have a lot of books, and I can stay here and I can write, and it's been good, but it takes tremendous discipline to write from a blank screen and do your writing. You know, Maya Angelou said, easy writing is damn hard work. And I agree with her. And James Baldwin said, we write out of one thing only, our own experience, So all of it for me was in my mind, because I've experienced racism in Liverpool. Growing up as a child, I was chased by skinheads with chains. And if they had caught me, I probably wouldn't be here talking to you, Daren, today. I can still remember I was 12 years of age in Liverpool in the 1970s. And I was being chased for my life. And I got away by the grace of God. But that keeps in your mind and propels you to write about race and racism, because it's such an ugly thing. You mentioned earlier also about white nationalism.
Right.
people often get this, they think white nationalism, black nationalism, same thing, different, bit like, you know, and I have a real problem with that. And I've explained it again in the book. The book explains this difference between white nationalism and black nationalism. The difference between the two, in short, white nationalism has endeavored to conquer people, has endeavored to dehumanize people, has endeavored to take the land from people, has endeavored to take away their humanity, has endeavored to hurt and maim and lynch and kill African Americans and people of color globally. You know, segregation. All of these things, their popular culture has destroyed, tried to destroy the humanity of people of color. Now, this is all part and parcel of white nationalism. If you turn the leaf and look at black nationalism, fundamentally, black nationalism is about doing for self, creating economic prosperity in your own community, developing a sense of self that allows you to express your humanity, have an education that speaks to your history positively, and you're not a social problem anymore. You know, black nationalism is about taking care of the politics in your community and having a voice, not about violence. Show me somewhere where black people have organized to go and take the land of people, kill people, have lynching parties. Show me that in black nationalism. Black nationalism has only been distorted, just like black power. Martin Luther King didn't like the phrase black power, but he liked the underlying element of black power, which was to have economic power, political power, social power, in order to deal with the deep discrimination in the broader society. If black people could spread their dollar around each other a little bit more, even today, a lot of the social problems would disappear. So, but black nationalism has never been about hurting white people. It's been about uplifting black people.
So we got to leave it there, Dr. Christian, but I want to ask you real quickly before we go, where can people tap into your book?
This book is available via Kendall Hunt website. So just tap in Kendall Hunt, and the title, The 20th Century Civil Rights Movement, an Africana Studies Perspective. Can I just finish on this?
I'm out of time. So I gotta bring it. That means I gotta bring it back. That's all.
We're going to talk again, Daren. It's always good to speak to you.
Always good to talk to you too, Dr. Mark Christian, Chair of Africana Studies, Lehman College. Thank you so much for being with us. His book is 20th Century Civil Rights Movement. We encourage you to get it and find out more about it. Got to take a quick break here on the Social Justice Forums. We got our history lesson. Now we're going to talk even further in depth coming up after this break.
We know that people are dealing with the health crisis, but there's also a lot of food insecurity.
We're giving out healthy food options, and that's what's key here.
If you're a senior, you have a disability, they'll actually deliver meals to you.
The residents are anxious, they're worried, they're scared, they want to be tested.
When things were happening in our community and we couldn't get the help.
There's almost a presumption of criminality that attaches to your skin color.
The site will prioritize those who are at highest risk in the population.
If you feel symptoms and you'd like to visit one of these COVID-19 testing sites here in the Bronx, you may call the State Health Department's hotline.
Important to note about this site is no reservations are needed. This is a walk-in clinic.
A lot of us are out of work and looking for something to do.
We have the machinery and the skills to make large scales of these masks and gowns.
Take care of your people. It's going to go way further than we actually can understand.
Right now, employees like myself are just adjusting
to the new reality.
Reporting from BronxNet, this is Arthur Tran.
When taking public transportation, don't touch your phone. Carry hand sanitizer and use it immediately upon leaving the bus or train. Avoid touching your face. If someone is coughing or sneezing, move away. Wash your hands with soap and water as soon as possible. Limit contact with poles. If possible, avoid rush hour. Don't eat or drink on public transportation. Keep your bag off the floor or other surfaces. Avoid directly touching turnstiles. Stay up to date with the latest from your local health department and CDC.
And welcome back to the show. On January the 6th, rioters stormed the United States Capitol, supporting the United States president at the time, Donald Trump, in his attempt to overturn and defeat the November 2020 presidential election. After breaching multiple police perimeters, they occupied, vandalized, and ransacked parts of the building for several hours. The insurrection led to the evacuation and lockdown of the Capitol building and disrupted a joint session of Congress assembled to count the electoral votes and formalize President-elect Joe Biden's election victory. Black activists are strongly coming out against a growing narrative amongst conservatives that equates the deadly siege on the U.S. Capitol with last summer's Black Lives Matter protests of racial injustice. Joining us to tell us their point of view on the matter, I'm joined by activist and member of the Justice League NYC, Keris Love. And Keris, good to have you.
Hi, it's good to see you again.
Happy New Year. And as we speak right now, a new president, but we do have to talk about the old one for a second. The one that actually was the one who was responsible for inciting insurrection. Give me your perspective on the fact that they tried to equate it with Black Lives Matter and tried to say that the insurrection and Black Lives Matter had similar ties.
Well, the first thing is that we were out last spring, last summer, and to be quite honest, we've been out ever since we've been dropped off in this country against our will. We were out protesting the lives of Black people who were murdered by the hands of the state. So that was our fight. Our fight is like, listen, you're killing us in our homes. You're pulling us over and you're killing us. You're killing our children as they're playing in the park, and we're not receiving any justice. And so that's why we were out trying to repeal a lot of the police reforms that allow police officers to murder us and then go free and have their records hidden. And so what we saw on January 6th, people are saying it's unprecedented, and it's not. It has happened in our history before. What we see is white supremacists trying to protect white supremacy. That is it. That is what we saw. They were very upset that their president did not win the election. He lost fair and square. And so they are afraid when white supremacy is threatened and it's like, well, they're going to take our power away, which is not going to happen with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Like, let's be clear. But the comfortability that Trump allowed them to have with their hate, they don't want to give that up. And so they wanted another 4 years to really double down on white supremacy and power. And so that's why they were storming the Capitol. Not because they're oppressed. Not in any way are they oppressed. We have elections as part of our democracy. You have an election, whoever wins, that's the president. People come out and vote, and that's what it is. And that's what happened. But they were really out there holding on to the narrative of white supremacy.
Yeah. So as you looked at the election, I'm sorry, you look at the insurrection that took place on January 6th, walk me through what you saw and what your thoughts were.
So the first thing I saw was the United States that I know. I saw police officers not enforcing the law, not being afraid of their life. I saw, for our side, I saw that police don't need de-escalation training and all of these things. They were perfectly fine. They were actually letting them in. I saw how folks in power, police, because they have power, they do not look at the Proud Boys and the white supremacists as a threat, because those are their cousins, those are their friends, they share similar ideology. Also, this country has a way of letting us know that when Black people are coming on the scene, we need to prepare, because this country views us as being inherently violent. They do not view white people that way. But then there was also some other things. Although I understand the reality of what the United States is, this illegal settler colony, what it was built on, part of me was also pretty hurt. I spent all spring, last summer, and even before 2020, being tear gassed. In August, I was shot at with pepper bullets. I had military tanks chasing myself and a group of women I organized with in Rochester, New York, because we were trying to get justice for Daniel Prude, which is a Black man that Rochester police murdered, even though they had already knew that he was having a mental health episode, and they murdered him naked in the street. And so Rochester police responded with pepper bullets, expired tear gas. They threw expired tear gas at us in the middle of a pandemic, shooting us with pepper bullets. I had to get away in my car with the sniper lasers on my car, not knowing if I was going to make it back to the Bronx. And so these are all the things that I've experienced just in the last couple of months. And so to see them break through a federal building, taking pictures of legal documents, stealing Nancy Pelosi's laptop. I mean, it was emotional, because of every time I went out into the streets, we didn't know if we were going to make it back, just for saying, could you stop killing Black people? And so there were a bunch of emotions that I felt, two sides of emotions, but I think overall, I watched that and said, the United States really do not care about Black bodies.
So walk me back to the Capitol for a minute, because as you talk about those who are taking selfies and those who opened the way for insurrectionists to be able to make their way to the Capitol, we are talking about a certain portion of the police. It's not all. I mean, we did see those who were fighting. We did see those who were resisting against those protesters, the insurrectionists that were entering in. As a matter of fact, we saw the story of a young African-American man who actually led a bunch of people who were getting ready to hit the Senate away from the Senate. Talk to us about, that, because I think in many times when we talk about police, that there is this overarching theme that all police are bad. But I want to get your clarity on that. Do you feel as all police are bad, or are we just highlighting the ones in your statement that spoke to the ones that did negative?
So I think that there's police are people when they go home at night. And when I saw that Black man alone trying to stop them from coming up the steps, and at one point running away, my heart broke for him, because it's clear that he signed up for a job to protect and serve. Unbeknownst to him, the culture and the history of our policing system in this country started on slave catching. And I know I had Black cops reach out to me and say, I cannot believe that happened, especially knowing what I know you went through. And my heart is broken, because they actually signed up to protect and serve the people. And now they have colleagues of theirs that left them hanging. That Black officer, it was also a Black woman who has lost her job because she hit back one of the white supremacists who punched her. And so they signed up to protect and serve, because that's what we say the police do. But then to know that your colleague is out the way, to let them in, his fellow officers left him hanging because white supremacy was more important than protecting and serving the people. And so I can't even imagine what he might be going through right now. He did his job, but that blue line will go out the window. If I'm a white officer, or if I'm an officer that upholds white supremacy, I'm going with that side. And so now you have that dynamic happening where he was left all alone to protect the Capitol. And I think it also showed us that we never said that blue lives did not matter. What we said is that Black lives matter as well as everyone else, and we would like to be treated as such. And so in that moment, that officer was not only an officer, but he also was a Black man whose life did not matter at that moment because his fellow officers chose white supremacy over protecting and serving.
So talk to me about the incoming presidential administration, President Joe Biden, also Vice President Kamala Harris, the first African-American vice president ever to be elected in United States history, as well as the first person of Asian descent ever to take the place of being a vice president. Give me your thoughts on what you're hoping and your emotions of the recent inauguration.
I'm first hoping that, and not just hoping, I'm actually extremely confident about this. I'm really confident that Joe Biden and Kamala will get a handle on the coronavirus, which is still prevalent. That did not go anywhere. It's still disproportionately impacting Black and brown and poor communities. And we're seeing with the rollout with the vaccine, our own mayor here in New York City is saying we're going to run out of vaccine soon. So I'm very confident that they're going to get a handle on that, which is kind of like the first pandemic that we're living in. And so that is like the immediate need to stop the bleeding because hospitalizations are going up, people are getting sick. And so as far as that is concerned, I'm very confident that they're going to restore that science matters in this country. I think they're going to restore our relationships globally. We are not looking favorable around the world, not just with how the last president handled the pandemic, but also how he handled the pandemic, handled the racial injustice uprisings, and all of these things. So I'm confident that they're going to at least reset us. And that's important before we can actually move on and do the real systemic change. So I know that he's going to be signing a bunch of executive orders. I'm looking for the first 100 days for Americans to be able to breathe again. And then the real work can happen because we've just experienced 4 years of serious trauma.
What about civil rights? I mean, obviously, that's of importance to yourself, and that's what you fight for, civil rights and social justice. Talk to us about your perspective on this new administration and the look at social justice. We're going to see a new attorney general, if confirmed, Merrick Garland, the former Supreme Court nominee who was blocked by the Republican Party from getting an up or down vote. He'll actually take the place of being the attorney general. Are you optimistic that this administration and this incoming attorney general, if confirmed, will be able to bring forth much needed change?
Well, I think that I'm actually going to put a little bit of the pressure on them. After what Black activists and organizers led by Stacey Abrams and a team of Black women just did in Georgia, it would be in their best interest to take civil rights and social justice extremely seriously. We are always asked every 4 years to save this country, and then we walk away getting crumbs no matter who's the president. So after handing Joe Biden and Kamala Harris the presidency and flipping Georgia, it would really be in their best interest to listen to Black organizers and Black activists because we're not looking for the moderate middle of the road anymore. We're looking for HR 40, for reparations, the study bill to be passed immediately. Some of us don't even understand what we need to study, but we'll take the course. We're looking for the no-knock warrants federally to be abolished. Like, we're looking for those things, and we're not asking, we're demanding. And we've already shown that we're going to work the electoral politics system. So it really would be in their best interest to do what they need to do for the Black community, specifically who's been upholding this country since 1619. So I guess I'm optimistic, but on the other hand, I'm almost like, yeah, you owe us. So what you got to show us?
Right. Talk to me about activism. Do you think that with what we've seen recently, the wave of insurrection that took place at the Capitol. Do you think that this has fueled activism, excuse me, particularly on the part of those in the African American community and communities of color?
Well, so I do want to not to alarm people is that what we saw on January 6th was a dress rehearsal. These folks are not going to go away. They're not. And we've seen it in our history before. As far as the fuel in the Black community or Black organizers and activists, those of us who've been in this fight since forever will continue to be in this fight. But I have experienced the community asking, how can they find their assignment? Like, what is my assignment in all of this because of what I watched? And you know, in their mind, it's like, well, Joe Biden won the presidency, so we shouldn't have any issues. And they're realizing that the extreme, because we need to call them extremists because that's what they are. If they were brown, if they were Muslim, that's what they would have been called. These extremists are here to stay, and people are trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we take over? How do we regain power? How do we help with the fight? And so it is our job to continue to organize, to continue to actually talk about the history. We saw this in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. It was the biggest massacre that happened for 100 years. They didn't talk about it. Same situation. White supremacists were mad because Black people were coming into the state legislature and gaining power 30 years after emancipation and stormed businesses, stormed the state capitol, and all those things. So when we talk about our history, it'll help us to know where we're going and how to handle these situations and not really sit in the shock and do the work and move forward, because it's going to take us and the administration. Like, I'm not expecting to say, well, we flipped Georgia, you won, and that's it, and leave it on Kamala and Joe Biden, because that's not fair. We have to still continue to organize. We have to still continue to stay in the streets safely, and we have to still continue to educate in our communities.
So where do we go from here? I mean, where does your work go? I mean, obviously, a new administration doesn't mean that new things happen automatically, but it does mean that we have to take a look at some things and possibly revisit some things. Talk about the work that you're doing right now and what you like to see accomplished.
So where do we go from here? I want to highlight some congressional races here, especially here locally. We got Dr. Jamal Bowman to Congress, who's representing parts of the Bronx and Westchester. And he is a former middle school principal who supports reparations, who supports defunding the police and all of those things like that. We've got Cori Bush out of St. Louis, who is an activist, who is now in Congress. And so wins like that are really important because the president and vice president can't do it alone. And so where do we go from here? We continue to work with these folks that we supported that are now in office, that will be passing legislation, that will be writing bills and introducing legislation. That's where we go from here. We stay on top of the administration. We do not stop campaigning our campaigns and needs. We do not stop phone banking. We do not stop marching. We do not stop protesting. We do not stop digitally organizing. We don't stop any of those things. And we continue to have meetings with those in Congress, and we look forward to, I mean, we did it in Georgia, but we look forward to really shaking up the Senate. I mean, we saw how Mitch McConnell had all of this power and why Georgia was so important. And we have to go into communities that may not be as progressive as ours, but who are suffering from the lack of needs that we have, and do the education to understand why we need a more balance of power. And so that's where we go from here. We stay on top of the administration. We continue conversations with our congressmen and our senators, and we pay attention to we should be paying attention to who's taking Kamala Harris' seat. Her seat is now open, and that's important. We don't just say, well, she's the vice president. We will not have another Black once she well, as of today, we won't have another Black woman. Like, she's leaving that seat now. And so what does that look like? And so that's where we go from here. We continue fighting and we continue organizing.
Speak to people about how important grassroots is. Grassroots organizing has been the backbone for getting a lot of things accomplished, particularly in the area of social justice. Talk to us about how important a grassroots movement is. And for people who may not be familiar with the Justice League NYC, tell us a little bit more.
So I start with Justice League NYC is the task force of the Gathering for Justice. The Gathering for Justice was founded by Mr. Harry Belafonte, who we know was Dr. King, one of Dr. King's right-hand man, who the stories that Mr. B has about the civil rights movement are ones that I take with me into the community, which is why grassroots organizing is so important. The people closest to the problem are the people closest to the solution. So if the problem is housing or, stagnant wages, those who make minimum wage, those who are struggling to pay those bills, they understand what they need to fix these problems. And so that's why grassroots organizing is important. You can't fix the systemic issues if you don't know exactly how they impact people on an everyday level. And so that's what we do. We continue to organize with the people in the community and kind of be like that bridge between the electoral politics and talking with your elected officials, which is fine, but really base building in community, knowing what the everyday struggles are, so that way you can bring that to your elected officials. And so we know from Ella Baker and even Dr. King and even Mr. B that you don't go into communities and tell them what the problem is and how to fix it. Grassroots organizing is going into the community, finding the leaders, listening, but then just giving them the tools that they need to fix whatever's happening in their community, because they're the closest to the solution. And so that's what Justice League does all across New York City and actually across the country, because we are a nationwide activist group.
And we know that Harry Belafonte is the founder and really the foundation for the work that you actually do. Give us a little bit more about Mr. Belafonte. What have you learned from him? And is there any story or experience that speaks out to you about Harry Belafonte?
This talking with the elders always warms my soul. Mr. B says that every generation is responsible for their revolution. However, the generations before you have left you breadcrumbs, so you don't have to start from scratch. And I love that because I am responsible for how 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2020 is written in the history books. But I know that I carry the legacy because this is an intergenerational fight. Mr. B, being an artist, and I'm an artist myself, a songwriter, he always tells us that artists need to use their platform for the movement. And so he would follow the lead of Dr. King. And a lot of times presidents will call Mr. B because he was this well-known, artist and musician and actor. And they would ask him, oh, what should we do? And he would say, did you call Martin? And they're like, well, we want to talk to you. And he's like, Martin's the leader, because he understood his place as an artist in the movement. One of the funny stories he told is, he said, at one point, I was just making albums so I can make money to fund the movement. And Martin would call and say, hey, I need you to meet me in Alabama because I need some money. And Mr. B will call Sidney Poitier and say, Martin needs $30,000 and we need to meet him down in Alabama, which was dangerous because we're talking Jim Crow South. And so it didn't matter that Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte, they were just two Black men. So it didn't matter. But that always stays with me because we need our artists in this movement. We need people with big platforms in this movement, but we need to understand that the actual organizers are the ones with the tools for the community. And so I'm honored to still have the teachings of Dr. King and Kingian nonviolence, and that we still have Mr. B here and that we have him around. And what I say to young people, because it feels like last summer was the start of the movement, and it's kind of disrespectful because our elders have been doing this. It wasn't the start of the movement, it was just a continuation because this is a marathon. And so if you know any elders, they have all the wisdom. They have all the wisdom, and we really need to be talking to them because they left us breadcrumbs, as Mr. B says.
Yeah, and it's amazing to think, and you hear the story of how everybody sees the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the work that he's doing on the forefront for civil rights, but there were so many people supporting the movement, you know, financially, supporting the movement emotionally. And here you have, even with the artistry that's actually coming and supporting the movement so that way King can be able to do it. So even though King gets a lot of the credit, we do know that it's persons such as Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Mahalia Jackson, C.L. Franklin, others that actually helped to get people to where they are today. So a life lesson that's actually pretty well learned. So for you, any future aspirations politically or such?
I get asked that question, and I won't say a hard no, but right now my assignment is to continue the grassroots work. My assignment is to be that bridge between electoral politics and the community right now. My assignment is also to meet the needs of my community. You know, I can't ask them to be interested in a race and why you should vote and why you should come to this community board meeting if I'm also not addressing the fact that they don't have childcare, or I'm not addressing the fact that they're standing on the food pantry line because they've been out of work since March, right? And so that's part of my assignment, is to also meet their immediate needs, finding mutual aid to uplift my community so they have the strength to actually do the fight. So as far as political aspirations, not really sure, but I like the role that I'm in. I get to meet with elected officials. They pick my brain and say, hey, what's happening in the community? How can we best bring about this information? And I'm in the middle between the both. So right now, that's really important. That's kind of my role and my assignment, and to use my artistry, my platform, to talk about things that are kind of difficult.
All right. Keris, we got to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Social Justice Forums. Great conversation. And again, Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you. Thank you for having me.
All right, Keris Love, our guest here on the Social Justice Forums. I want to let you know that unfortunately we come to the end of our show today, but we hope that you've enjoyed this week's discussion talking about the issues of social justice, taking a look at civil rights, taking a look at the Capitol insurrection, and about Black Lives Matter. What our show wants to do, we want to promote discussion and also promote civic engagement. You may agree, you may not, you may disagree. That's your perspective, right? But you do have the ability to also be involved and get engaged. And we hope that our conversation has provoked some sort of engagement on your part. Listen, if you want to watch the show, of course, you can rewatch this edition. You can catch Recablecast on BronxNet TV or BronxNet.org. And then if you want to join a new conversation, come back and join us next week for another edition of the Social Justice Forums. I'm Daren Jaime saying take care, God bless, and let's enjoy this 2021.